The champagne was still running down her collarbone when the man at the podium stopped mid-sentence. Marcus Ellery stood beside his wife's chair, an empty ice bucket dangling from one hand, waiting for the room to laugh with him. Some of them did, the nervous kind of laugh people give when they're more afraid of being the next target than they are ashamed of themselves. His mother lifted her wine glass 2 inches off the table, a private toast to a job she believed her son had finally finished. But Renata didn't cry. She didn't stand. She didn't even reach for a napkin. She sat very still in a navy blue dress that was now soaked through at the shoulders, ice cubes melting into her lap, and she looked past her husband, past his mother, past 300 people pretending to study their dinner plates, straight at the stage. That was the moment the keynote speaker went pale. Because he knew her face. And in the 2 seconds it took him to find his voice again, the entire tone of the evening quietly changed hands. If you're the kind of person who believes quiet people are often the strongest ones in the room, stay with me, because what happened in the next 20 minutes didn't just end a marriage. It ended the life Marcus thought he'd built for himself. The Whitfield Foundation Spring Gala was the kind of event where the flowers cost more than most people's rent. 340 guests filled the ballroom of the Ashcombe Hotel. Developers, attorneys, philanthropists, a few city council members hoping to be photographed near the right people. Chandeliers threw soft gold light across white tablecloths. A jazz trio played somewhere near the bar. Everyone smelled like money that had stopped trying to prove itself. And at the center of the program, printed in raised gold letters, was one name: Marcus Ellery, this year's Rising Leader honoree. Smart real estate developer. Smoother talker than most men, twice his experience. A man who had learned to look accomplished long before he'd actually accomplished much. His mother, Corinne, had arrived early to inspect the room the way a general inspects a battlefield. She wore ivory and an expression that suggested tonight's applause would finally validate every opinion she'd ever had about her son, and about the woman who, in her mind, had never deserved him. 2 tables over sat Priya, dressed in copper silk, seated just close enough to Marcus to be improper and just far enough to be deniable. Her hand found his forearm twice during the appetizer course. Nobody at the table said her name out loud. Nobody needed to. Renata sat 2 chairs from her own husband. She wore no extra jewelry except one small brooch, sapphire rimmed in delicate silver work, pinned near her left shoulder. It had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who used to tell her that dignity was the only inheritance nobody could take from you unless you gave it away yourself. Renata had worn it the night she met Marcus. She wore it again tonight, though the room had long since forgotten what that kind of woman actually looked like. When Marcus reached for the ice bucket, the conversation at the table thinned to nothing. He didn't announce it. He didn't look at her face. He simply stood, tipped the silver bucket, and let cold water and half-melted ice pour over his wife's head in front of everyone who mattered to him. "Maybe now," he said loud enough for the closest tables to hear, "you'll stop acting like you belong in rooms like this." Priya laughed first. Corinne nodded like a woman confirming a theory. And the room did what frightened rooms do, it went still and pretended not to be watching. Nobody in that ballroom knew that Renata had already decided, 5 weeks earlier, exactly how this night would end. And it wasn't like this. To understand what Marcus didn't see coming, you have to go back further, to a version of Renata nobody at that gala had ever bothered to ask about. Long before the marriage, before the brooch, before the dress that would end up ruined on a hotel floor, Renata Cole was the kind of woman who changed the direction of people's lives without ever putting her name on the outcome. She worked out of a cramped office above a dry cleaner's with one desk, one old laptop, and a black notebook that never left her side. Inside it were names, hundreds of them. Investors. Board chairs. Nonprofit directors. Notes on who needed what and who could quietly make it happen. She didn't advertise what she did. She simply did it. If a young founder needed the right introduction, Renata knew who to call. If a struggling nonprofit needed a credible board chair, she already had 3 names in mind. She built her influence the slow way, not through visibility but through being useful to people who would remember it later. One of those people was a soft-spoken engineer named Desmond Okafor, who she met at a community innovation breakfast nobody important had bothered to attend. He had a rough pitch deck and a product most investors dismissed as too risky. Renata didn't hear risk. She heard something worth building. She made 3 phone calls that week. By the following year, Desmond had funding. Within 5 years, his company, Halcyon Freight Systems, had offices in 4 states, and Desmond stood on stages very much like this one. Renata never asked for a cut. Never asked to be thanked publicly. She helped and then she stepped back into the quiet. That was who she was, and it's exactly how Marcus first found her, at a downtown real estate mixer where he'd shown up hungry for exactly the kind of doors she knew how to open. He was charming in the early years. Attentive. He listened when she talked about neighborhood investment like her ideas actually mattered to him. And for a while maybe they did. Renata introduced him to foundation chairs, zoning attorneys, developers looking for young talent with polish. Doors opened. Calls got returned. Marcus rose fast, and because he rose standing on a foundation he hadn't built, he slowly convinced himself the elevation was entirely his own. Corinne encouraged that story. She'd never liked how little space Renata took up in a room. To her, quiet wasn't strength, it was a lack of ambition, something to be managed, maybe even corrected. Over dinners, she'd offer comments dressed up as concern. Renata's clothes were too plain, her voice too soft, her presence didn't match where Marcus was headed. What she actually meant was simpler. Renata couldn't be controlled by vanity, and Corinne had never learned how to deal with a woman like that. The marriage didn't collapse all at once. It eroded. A phone turned face down at dinner, a new cologne, meetings that ran late and smelled like someone else's perfume. Renata noticed everything and said very little. She'd seen Marcus and Priya once outside a restaurant downtown, standing too close beneath a street lamp, Priya's fingers straightening his tie with a familiarity that had no business belonging to a stranger. Renata didn't confront him that night. She went home instead because she understood something Marcus never gave her credit for: timing. The real turning point came 5 weeks before the gala. She was searching for a charging cable in his travel bag when her hand found a second phone, one she'd never seen. No passcode. That detail hurt more than any message could have. A locked phone would have meant he was afraid of being caught. An unlocked one meant he'd stopped believing she'd ever bother to look. What she found inside wasn't just an affair. It was a plan. Messages between Marcus, Priya, and his mother, coordinating the exact night, the exact moment, to make Renata's humiliation as public as possible. Corinne had written, "Make sure she doesn't cling to him all evening. The gala should make things obvious." Priya had replied, "Leave that to me." And Marcus, in his own words, had promised his mother that by the end of the night, Renata would finally understand where she stood. Renata read it 3 times. Her hands didn't shake. She put the phone back exactly where she'd found it, zipped the bag closed, and went to the closet, where she took down a small cedar box holding her grandmother's brooch. Then she called the one person she trusted completely, her closest friend since college, Odalise, who worked in event production and happened to know exactly who was giving the keynote address at this year's Whitfield Gala. Desmond Okafor. "I need your help," Renata told her. "And I need you to trust me before you understand why." Odalise said yes without hesitation. In the days that followed, Renata behaved as though nothing had changed. She cooked dinner. She pressed Marcus's shirts. She sat through one particularly unbearable meal where Corinne planned the seating chart like a coronation, reminding Renata, mid-dessert, that the best thing she could do was stay elegant and stay invisible. Renata simply said, "Of course," and the quieter she became, the more confident they all grew, which was exactly what she needed. At night, once the house had gone still, she opened her old notebook and photographed pages tied directly to the very foundation now honoring her husband. Names, dates, introductions Marcus had quietly claimed credit for over the years. She wasn't building a weapon. She was building a record. Then she reached out to 3 women she'd helped years earlier, now sitting on boards and chairing committees of their own. Women who owed nothing to Marcus and everything to a favor Renata had never asked to be repaid. Each one said yes to attending the gala before Renata had even finished asking. By the night of the event, the stage, in every sense, was already set. The champagne was only the spark. 20 minutes after Marcus emptied that ice bucket over her, Renata stood in the hotel's private lounge, looking at her own reflection. She pressed a towel beneath her eyes, reset her lipstick, pinned back a damp section of hair, and straightened her shoulders. The brooch still caught the light. That mattered more to her than the dress ever could. When she walked back into the ballroom, Marcus actually forgot to keep talking. He'd expected her to disappear. Instead, she moved calmly from table to table, greeting people by name, and something in the room's temperature began to shift. This wasn't a woman trying to save face. It was a woman who had never needed the room's permission to matter. Backstage, Odalise was making one small adjustment to the program, an unscheduled acknowledgement segment right after the keynote. Desmond had approved it the instant he understood exactly who was sitting in that ballroom, and exactly what had just been done to her. When Desmond stepped up to the podium, he opened with the usual thanks, the foundation, the mission, the numbers. Then he stopped. "Forgive me," he said. "I'm going to step away from my prepared remarks." The room quieted. He looked out past Marcus's table toward the back. "There's a woman here tonight," he said, "whose name most of you should know far better than you do. Years ago, before my company had a single investor, I was one conversation away from giving up. I had the idea. I didn't have the room. Then a woman sat with me for 20 minutes, opened a notebook and made 3 phone calls that changed the entire direction of my life. She never asked for anything in return. Her name is Renata Cole." Every head in the ballroom turned. Desmond's eyes found her near the back wall, one hand resting lightly over the sapphire brooch. "I recognized that brooch tonight," he said. "She was wearing it the day we met. She told me her grandmother believed grace and strength could live in the same person." A screen behind him lit up, a photographed page from her notebook, names and dates in her own handwriting, tracing donor relationships and board introductions this very foundation had built its reputation on. "My team looked into several of this foundation's long-standing partnerships," Desmond said. "Many of them didn't start with the man being honored tonight. One by one, 3 women stood. Each said in her own words the same thing: 'She opened that door for me.'" Priya took a step back from Marcus's side, then another, her face going flat. Corinne sat frozen, her hand locked around her glass, watching the room's admiration quietly transfer away from her family and into an accounting she couldn't stop. Desmond asked Renata to join him. She walked to the stage unhurried, in a dress still marked by what had been done to her. She didn't take the microphone. She didn't say a word about Marcus. She simply inclined her head, and the applause started at the back of the room and rolled forward until every guest who had sat in silence during her humiliation was on their feet. That was the part Marcus never recovered from, not the applause but her indifference. She didn't look at him once. The fallout came quickly. A board opened a review. A development partner quietly withdrew from a pending deal. People who used to answer Marcus's calls on the first ring stopped answering at all, not because of gossip alone, but because once people understood how much of his success had been standing on a woman he'd humiliated in public, they stopped trusting the man underneath the polish. Priya's name vanished from his life within a week. Corinne's phone calls to old friends went colder each time she made them. Renata didn't argue publicly. She changed the locks, had the paperwork delivered properly, and let Marcus's messages, anger, then blame, then apology, then desperation, go unanswered because every one of them still carried the same mistake. He thought he'd lost a wife. What he'd actually lost was the quiet architecture that had been holding up his entire life. Months later, on a bright Saturday morning, Renata sat on the porch of a small house she'd bought in her own name, tea beside her, the brooch pinned to a plain linen blouse and a brand new notebook open on the table. Desmond had offered her a formal advisory role at Halcyon, with real compensation and one handwritten note that made her sit down when she read it. This should have happened years ago. She cried a little that morning, not from sadness, but from the strange, almost unbearable relief of finally being seen. Across town, Marcus sat in an apartment that never quite felt like home, scrolling through old photos, stopping longest on the one from that night, Renata standing near the stage, composed, lit gold by the chandeliers, while the whole room rose around her. In every version of that memory he wished he could go back and stop his own hand. But some choices don't leave room for apology. Back on her porch, Renata turned to a new page in her notebook and wrote down the name of a young woman starting a literacy nonprofit across town. Then she made 2 phone calls. Because that had always been who she was. Not the woman who got humiliated at a gala, not the woman who got underestimated in a marriage, but the woman who knew how to build something lasting out of nothing. And this time whatever she built, it would belong to her. Sometimes the quietest person in a room isn't the weakest one. Sometimes they're the beam holding the ceiling up, and the people standing beneath it never notice how much weight they're carrying until the structure shifts. Marcus thought public humiliation would make Renata smaller. Instead, it revealed exactly how much of his life had been resting on strength he never once acknowledged. What would you have done in her place? Walked away quietly, or let the truth do the talking the way she did? If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments, and if you want more stories about quiet strength and the kind of justice that doesn't need to raise its voice like this video, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it today.